Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Donohoe, and I am a managing director and the co-host of the Green Rush podcast. And I'm so excited to join you in moderating the panel, Raising Early Stage Capital. We have a great panel of guests, so let me not waste any more time and start some introductions here. Cody Shandraw is the director from Ambria Capital, a company that invests in emerging public and private companies. The firm has made 41 deals in the psychedelic space so far, and the portfolio companies include Gwella, Wisana Health, and Awaken Life Sciences. Ken Belotsky is a partner at Negev Capital, which invests in companies, little feedback there, but companies developing novel psychedelic medications for various mental health issues. Josh Lawler is a partner and attorney from Zuber Lawler, where he handles M&A, finance, and corporate matters for private equity groups and public and private companies. He's also represented leading plant medicine companies for more than 14 years. And finally, Lindsey Hoover, the founder of JLS Fund, which focuses on investments in the intersection of science, technology, and neuroscience, leveraging the potential of plant-based and psychedelic medicines to heal illness and enhance wellness. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Well, thanks, guys. So let's jump in. Lindsey, I want to start with you. What are some of the biggest challenges for companies looking for early stage investment in this market?
You're talking about the companies that are looking for investment?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm actually not sure it's such a challenging environment for psychedelic companies right now, relatively speaking, to be honest. I think that the challenges are more for the investors trying to determine which science is real and what should I be paying, because the valuations can get extremely frothy. And I think the smart companies are thinking about the future as one does as a startup, and thinking that they want to be able to attract, the next couple of rounds of capital. So you do have to kind of plan that out strategically and think about where your valuation is now and what's going to be realistic for the next round. Because having to raise a down round because you took advantage of a market that might have overvalued the company earlier on is not a good place to be. So I think there's some interesting challenges and dynamics, but shortage of capital doesn't appear to be one of them right now.
Ken, do you agree? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, sorry for that. Yes, so I absolutely agree with the statement. So there are so many investors right now trying to put money into the psychedelics companies because it became so much fashion right now about the space. So investors have challenges to choose right companies because early stage companies, they usually don't have enough data to prove the ideas, and we should check the science behind the views. And in this case, we should really check the management team, whether they're capable to achieve the next milestone and to get right result.
So speaking of management teams, what do you guys look for, when you're vetting a company and the management structure and the management personalities and organization? Are there any, and do you impart that wisdom onto investors? Cody, I'll just start with you.
It's tough, obviously, because anytime you're looking at a company, you always want to judge management off past successes, but that normally doesn't always guarantee future success, right? So I think the most important thing is the level of dedication that the team members are willing to show. Normally, I know if a CEO is waking up to take a phone call at 7 a.m. or 7 p.m., normally they're, for the cause. I would say one of the biggest things right now is actually echoing Lindsey's statement. The valuations over the last 24 months have almost 3x'd on average over what we were looking at in the past. So it's coming down now to, not only which management teams obviously have the reputation, but also the science that Ken was talking about, making sure that, you're getting independent third-party results back on a lot of these things, because while we have decades of results on a lot of the existing compounds, I think a lot of the new drugs that are being developed, it's very early stage, so they're binary investments. They're either going to be worth a lot or worth nothing.
At their core, psychedelics are basically an early stage pharma and biotech industry. And so, these drugs, if they're going the FDA, the Health Canada route, are going to take, $1 to $2 billion in R&D to bring drugs to market. So should investors be looking at companies in this space to use the basic cost metric for things like psilocybin and MDMA and LSD? Josh, you want to weigh in there, or Ken?
Yeah, generally these numbers is for most of the companies that develop new drugs, but for companies that do it from scratch. But here we have compounds that are well known, and actually some of these compounds already tested for thousands of years that they're safe and people treat people well. So we believe that in psychedelic space you don't need so much cash to put the drug to the counter. And another point that, again, from statistic point of view, more than 50% of the companies that develop drugs, they're acquired by big pharma. So you don't need to spend so much money to get the right result finally.
Josh, can you weigh in there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with what Ken said. Absolutely, it's a different dynamic because we're not starting from scratch, and quite frankly, it's also a different dynamic because technology is a place where it really hasn't been before. Many of the psychedelics companies that we're working with will do things like bringing in, artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms to find, binding receptor sites on particular molecules that really narrow things down a lot more than the trial and error that you might be thinking of from kind of a historical perspective with pharmaceutical companies.
Are you finding that, early stage biotech companies, raise money on the promise of curing specific diseases, but I don't know that we've seen that much of that in the mental health or CNS sector. What makes is there a unique need right now, in this marketplace for these types of solutions? And how is that different from, let's say, oncology or Alzheimer's? How are you making psychedelics stand out?
Sure. I kind of disagree with the premise, to be honest.
Oh, great.
We see companies chasing particular indications all the time. In fact, most of them tend to be chasing particular indications, and varies. Some of them actually, believe it or not, cancer is involved, and I'm not sure how that bridges with oncology, but it can. But clearly the mental illnesses. There's folks who are chasing addiction, dementia, Alzheimer's, PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, but also things like Crohn's disease and things of that nature. I'm actually rather continuously surprised at all the different potential applications and indications. And if you're thinking about screening for early stage companies and who do you invest in and who don't you, at this point the science is super critical, because I feel like there's a company coming out with every possible indication. So we'll see what happens.
So the FDA, has shown a tremendous appetite for psychedelic drugs and therapies, to be put through the clinic stages. PTSD and treatment-resistant depression are really the furthest along, but there's still a few years, maybe less away. What other indications do you think have the greatest potential? And that question's open to anyone. So maybe Lindsey, you want to go first?
Lawyer that one.
I won't. All right, we won't ask the lawyer that one. Lindsey, Cody, what do you guys think?
I want to rewind a second back, because I think it's interesting what Josh brought up about technology. Not only is technology to accelerate drug development really advancing, but the phenotyping, the biomarker technology for psychedelics is very interesting, and it's another area that we're investing in. So we don't just invest in the drugs, we invest in the technology that's going to accelerate the space. And that technology, probably because of a lot of pickup by oncology initially, to phenotype patients and get better clinical trial outcomes is a very exciting part of why this is a unique time in the advent of psychedelic medicines, because the technology, the FDA's attitude, and the mental health crisis are really conspiring for a perfect storm for investors in this area. So in terms of the indications, again, I think the indications that people aren't really talking about yet in general that are the anti-inflammatory potential, which would touch on probably almost every disease we can imagine. It's amazing, the potential. And I think the other thing, you know, I'm talking a lot to people in traditional CNS and pharma, and everyone agrees that the mental health crisis is you know, it's just going to get so much bandwidth and attention. It was starting before COVID with the addiction crisis, and now we have, you know, the mental health crisis, and it's costing an awful lot. So, you know, it's almost like an entire new market sector is being opened up. And when people think of psychedelics, they think of psilocybin. But what we tell people is that's just really a loose term for just about every interesting thing in the jungle and the rainforest and the desert you can imagine, right? And so, yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of potential beyond mental health.
Cody, anything to add there?
I'd have to say addiction. I think every single person knows somebody that has been affected by either alcohol or drug addiction. So I'm most excited for not only the progress that is being made there, but also it seems like the FDA is eager to kind of ramp up programs that are exploring that. So.
And the panel before us just had Anthony from Awaken Life Sciences, and they're doing some really interesting work in the space of addiction. You know, and I think that company is going to be really interesting to watch. Ken, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, you know, our fund is focused on the drug development, and we support all indication that doesn't have enough presence in the market right now. So I fully agree with previous statements regarding addiction, also treatment-resistant depression. So any kind of addiction that people are suffering right now, we should support.
So we're getting a couple of questions in from our audience. So I'm just going to pepper them in if no one minds. So from Brendan Husey, how are you distinguishing between NCEs or new chemical entities and classic psychedelics in terms of risk in your models? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take that. I mean, I like IP. I think acquirers like IP. So yes, there's formulation IP and drug delivery IP. And if that's an important part, that's very exciting. I think it's laudable that people are willing to go naked into this market without IP protection, but it isn't really the way that we like to travel.
Yeah, just to add to that, and you know, again, lawyer, so risk model, not necessarily, but I can tell you from a business model perspective that there's a great deal of attention being placed on what can you patent. And you can't patent, you know, something that's occurring in nature and that's been around for thousands of years. So you end up with things like, you know, Johnson & Johnson's ketamine product, which is really more of a drug delivery patent, and no evidence that it works better than plain old regular ketamine, by the way. But nonetheless, they've patented something on drug delivery. You've got things like Compass trying to patent all the salt polymorphs of a particular substance, which, you know, may or may not actually ultimately work in terms of granted patents, but certainly sets a field for everybody else who might be there that they might have to fight against a Peter Thiel funded company. So it's got that kind of a barrier. So, you know, I think the new chemicals are, you know, people are going very hard towards developing and investigating them because they're easier to protect. They're easier to monetize. There's a bigger barrier to entry. It's a business model that is kind of something that classical pharma understands. So in terms of, you know, being acquired by a classical pharma company, you know, that's just a lot more attractive. And when you kind of put it that way, then, you know, yeah, you have to get through FDA and everything else, but it's really, there's a major value proposition if you can develop something that's going to be a little bit different than what's found in nature.
And there's another value in that you can design around things like side effects, duration. People are designing out the hallucinogenic effects. I mean, you can make things better by knowing specifically what you're shooting for. Whereas when you have a natural molecule, you know, you get what you get and you can play with it. But it's very interesting. I think that's one of the ways that these drugs will be applicable more broadly, is because in a certain situation, you want it to be oral and take it at home. In another situation, maybe it's a completely different animal that needs a longer acting or a stronger effect. So it's really a very salutary development in a sense that this industry was forced that way, because it's going to make it much more flexible and responsive to, you know, patient needs.
I think just to add on to Lindsey's point, listen, having a drug that you need to be in a chair for 4 to 6 hours on probably isn't going to be the best model going forward for traditional healthcare practices. So faster onset, shorter half-life is probably going to lead the charge in a lot of these NCEs.
Well, and I would think that, a lot of the cost that's associated with it is, the therapists that are in the room, you need at least 1 or 2 therapists there who know what they're doing, and it's 42 hours plus of therapy. So, if you can develop something that's shorter acting, can be taken at home, I would imagine the margins get a lot nicer, as they invest.
Yeah, kind of yes, kind of no. And you're talking about a lot of disruption there, because you do get into the question of like, okay, well, fine, but are the doctors going to prescribe something which is just taken at home and doesn't come with $200 an hour of sitting in a chair at a clinic? Is insurance going to cover something like that? There's a lot of models out there, especially in the telemedicine sector right now, that involve the idea of kind of guidance while somebody is actually in their home doing things. And I find it very exciting in terms of the potential benefit. And at the same time, if it commoditizes the market, is it going to get the same kind of attention from the larger companies? So it's a question.
One other question from Ali Fiducia, and I so apologize if I'm not pronouncing names right. For the panelists, are you foreseeing slow timelines by the FDA with the influx of psychedelic INDs? How does this impact your funding strategies?
Ken, you want to go first, or you want me to? I'll jump in.
I think that was a punt to you, Cody.
I mean, listen, anytime you're, especially on the new chemical entity side, there's always going to be that process. But I think now, because the interest level is so high across so many different indications, I don't see a slowdown in timelines. And as far as impacting funding strategies, listen, if we're making an investment in a company, most of the time it's because we believe in the company's mission and also the founders and management team to get this product at least through their phase 2 trials, obviously foreseeing any negative results. So, I think most of us that are involved here all have personal connections to the space. So a lot of us are planning on doing multiple rounds over multiple years with a lot of these companies. So as far as timelines, I really don't see whether it's a couple months or a couple years, I just can't imagine, for everybody on this call at least, that it's going to be impacting our strategies.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on the comparison to cannabis, but I think there's a decent amount of us on the line here who do have that cannabis experience, and there are a lot of overlaps. There's a lot of the same players in the space, the same investors. Are you guys? Are you seeing different ways to articulate the sales proposition for psychedelic companies? Are you using some of the same strategies? And, are you finding different capital requirements between the two industries?
I guess I could jump in here. We've done several investments in both verticals. Listen, cannabis is obviously much different. We can look at a company and immediately within a day understand their financials and exactly how this thing's going to scale out, with whatever required capital for the build out on additional growing space, processing space, manufacturing space, whatever the case may be. All of these companies, well, not all of them, most of them are pre-revenue. This is obviously something that gets back to making sure that the founders that you're investing in understand the business and also the model moving forward. So while there are comparables that, yes, they're very exciting new industries, I think that there's a lot of differentiating factors. As far as the players involved, listen, it seems like a lot of the guys that are early stage investors are obviously going to be early stage investors in both industries. It's a tremendous amount of asymmetric upside on a lot of these companies. So I think, it's just a function of being a new industry that you're going to attract, leading edge investors in most cases.
Yeah.
I was just going to say the clear differentiator in my mind is that there's a regulatory pathway, and FDA is giving breakthrough designation, and investors and everyone knows this playbook in cannabis. It was complete, and it still is kind of unknown, right? I mean, we still don't know if there's going to be legalization, banking issues. This is a sector that institutional investors can and will invest in and already are. If you look at who was in the Compass deal, it's public knowledge, right? So these are classic biotech folks already showing up. So I think for investors in general, and I'm sure all of us on the panel, it's exciting and new and yet old in ways that make everybody comfortable. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, we've done a great deal of work in both spaces, and they're very different. And really, the first thing to think about is that there's a rec market in cannabis that I don't think psychedelics are ever going to come close to touching. And the rec market in cannabis is really at this point, notwithstanding, Jazz Pharmaceuticals purchasing GW, the rec market is really kind of what it's about at the moment, as far as the deals go. If you look at everything that's happening, it's about footprints and dispensaries and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, obviously there's a great deal of attention focused on the medicinal also, but it's very different in the sense that cannabis, at least in the United States, was at a different kind of level of being outlawed to the point where there's no experimentation on it for decades. And, there's a leg up on the psychedelic space, along with the fact that certain of the psychedelics aren't really even illegal entirely. Some of them are already prescribable. There's, just much more information. Plus you have the fact that from a regulatory standpoint, cannabis is already beaten through the jungle, if you will, to the point where people are prepared for the idea of legalizing what has formerly been a scheduled substance. And then you can add to that the fact that you've got a lot of research where the indications that we've been talking about are very, very important to the government because, amongst other things, they're very big with veterans. So, you're talking about addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder, treatment-resistant depression. These are major, major, major items for the United States government. And, they look at it and there's an element of common sense to it. And then, as Lindsey was saying, you put all that together, and on the psychedelic front, it's pharma and it's legal. There's nothing illegal federally about, somebody developing a drug this way. It's like, you can do it, that's fine. And just like any other drug, it's got to go through FDA and everything else. Whereas on the cannabis space, with, one or two exceptions, you're still questioning the legality of even the medicinal uses. And we talk about states that go medicinal legal versus recreational legal. I mean, that's just not a discussion that you have on the psychedelic space. So from that perspective, they're really different. In terms of where we are now on psychedelics, as far as the kind of bleeding edge companies, most of them, not necessarily the ones listed on the exchange, the US exchanges already, that I think there's a lot of similarities because back when the cannabis stuff was starting out, nobody could figure out the business models there either. And it was the same discussion, like, who's the team? How dedicated are they? What are they likely to do? And, throw a dart. And, then we had the Canopy Growth InBev moment, which really just changed the entire cannabis kind of profile. And we haven't had that yet in psychedelics. And, I'm not sure that we will in that way, because obviously that was a rec market kind of play. But, at some point we'll see the first big pharma have a big acquisition of a psychedelic company, probably one that's already listed on an exchange, because that's starting to happen. And that'll be the equivalent moment. And, up until that happens, I haven't said it, but I will, as a retail investor, I take a basket approach. And obviously everybody else on here is an institutional investor and much better at picking investments and putting research into it and all that kind of stuff. I'm more of a hired gun to do whatever deal. But from my own following of the space, you're betting on the space, not necessarily a company in the space as much as the space. And for now, as long as market liquidity holds up and those types of things, that's a pretty good bet.
And I think
Josh, we know a market basket you can invest in. Let's talk after.
We should definitely talk after, Lindsey. No question.
Look at us doing deals on the panel. I think and wasn't there just another ETF announced? So I think that today, so that spread the wealth perspective as an investor, really makes a lot of sense. I want to pull back and talk process a little bit, just because I think it's interesting that, especially in the age of COVID and now in the age of this Delta variant where, there's pockets of the world that are still being shut down. How are you guys, what resources are you using to look for early stage investment? I mean, a lot of this used to be like, networking at events and meeting people for dinner and drinks. And, so what resources have you guys been using over the past, 18 months to do your jobs? Ken?
No, starts, yeah, I'm not the cannabis guy, so yeah. So first of all, we built our own database for psychedelic companies and checked their status and built a short list. And we, in most of the cases, we did like a direct approach. So we approached companies by ourselves. Secondly, we have a really good networking and doing deals with other funds like Ambria Capital. So we did a lot of deals with Cody and other funds as well. So it's really beneficial to build these relationships and share deals with each other. And third point, yes, for sure, participating in the conferences like we have right now, it's really important. And about the COVID, I think it's really better. So having Zoom meetings, it's really saves time. So for last 5 months, we have hundreds of Zoom meetings. So it's really not possible to do it face to face. So we don't have an issue with that.
Right. So no Zoom burnout for Ken.
Together.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cody. What else do you like?
I mean, listen, I'm still a dinner and drinks guy. I've been very fortunate being located in Southern Florida that I have had the privilege to meet with over a dozen of our portfolio companies, management teams. So that's obviously still a huge part of what I do. But network, I think, is so important, especially in today's day and age. We have several resources, whether it's the PsyTech conferences, the microdose conferences, Young America conferences, obviously KCSA. So it has been very nice hitting the conference circuit. And then also, like Ken said, working with other funds in the space. Very lucky we have great relationships with almost every other fund that's investing currently. We've done several deals together as syndicates with Ken, JLS, Noetic, the Conscious Fund. I mean, several of them. So it's nice, obviously, to see your peers in the space investing in some of the same companies. Obviously, being able to share due diligence is critical on a lot of these different things. So,
yeah, in our case, we got really lucky because my partners have been involved in this sector. One of them for 30 years. So we actually had hosted the first, at least in modern memory, when you still could travel, psychedelic investor conferences in 2019 in Beverly Hills and San Francisco. So deal flow has not been a problem at all for us. It's been more a problem of we need more money faster to invest in deals. Other than that, it's really been actually much more efficient because we already had the network established beforehand. But I think everybody's excited about being able to go, out and meet people, and especially when you do due diligence. In my mind, that's where actually meeting with the management team and the founders it's important. It's always been important to really know who you're investing in. So I think that is the most critical element of being able to, network again in person.
Go ahead, Josh.
I was going to say, I mean, just from the legal perspective, since we do deals for a lot of folks, one of the things that characterizes the industry maybe more than most others, everybody knows everybody. I mean, it's kind of what Cody was saying. I mean, it's like there's a very limited number of funds, in the kind of entire fund universe where BlackRock's at the top. It's pretty small AUM. And we're seeing kind of the same types of places. And the other piece of it is that, it is very mission driven. I mean, Cody was saying it earlier, and I know it's true for me and it's true for most people that I know, legal side, fund side, whichever, where there's really a reason why people are attracted to this piece of it, which, I think makes it a little bit easier to connect than, some of my PE clients where it's like, okay, I'm going to look at a company that makes aluminum siding. Like it's a little bit of okay, who cares? This is fundamentally different. I mean, pretty much every CEO I've spoken with is personally motivated by something in their own history or their own experiences. And that's, it's a little different.
And that story really matters. I mean, from a PR standpoint, that's what reporters want to hear too, is what's your story? What's your connection to this? Why psychedelics? And it sounds like that's an important part of kicking the tires too, when you're looking to invest. So, Cody and Lindsey had alluded, and Ken, to the fact that you guys have all worked together on deals. You've worked separately on deals. Is this, Ken or Josh, you kind of alluded to it now. Does this industry, is it ripe for collaboration in that regard versus like some other industries like aluminum siding, just to go off of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is very much so. And part of it is because, and I love the word basket approach. Lindsey apparently likes it also, but there's some safety here. Like, we're all looking at these molecules and the fact that there's a mountain of data that says they can help with all kinds of different stuff. But it's also all still very experimental, and you don't know who's going to succeed and who's going to fail. And from that perspective, it makes sense to diversify. And as Cody was saying, on terms of piggybacking on due diligence, why would it make sense for everybody to do the same due diligence as opposed to being able to share kind of information, recognizing that there's plenty of opportunity. And again, part of it is because most funds in the space don't have a ton of AUM. I don't see a lot of the same kind of competition that even in the cannabis space at this point, but certainly in kind of traditional private equity, where it's kind of like, oh my God, I'm scratching and clawing for deal flow. Deal flow hasn't really been a problem. So I think people are in a much more cooperative, collaborative mood.
And I think the other thing that's worth remembering, especially on the drug development side, is this is an expensive process. In classic Silicon Valley tech investing, people want to know who else is around the table to support the company in the subsequent rounds. So you really don't, competition is fine, but you really don't want to be alone in a deal. You want to have other hands around the table that support it and believe in it. It kind of may come down to who wants to be the lead and who doesn't. We prefer to lead. We don't really like to be passively involved in very many deals, but there are lots of people who want to play every role around the table. So far, it's working out really well, and I do think it's more collaborative because of the mission element. I think that's very true.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we have another question from Lily Sanders. Do you have to pick a side, cannabis or psychedelics? I feel like I have picked a side, and it's psychedelics, like Compass or MindMed versus cannabis companies. Who wants that one?
I guess I'll jump in there. I don't know. I think tribalism is a very strong feeling for a lot of people, and I tend to shy away from that whenever possible. So, listen, I think everything has its place in society. So, anytime you can support a company or founders or management team that you believe in, I think it's important to do so. So, I'm not a side picker.
I would say picking a side would dramatically cut my revenue, so that's not going to happen.
I think investors, though, in this area, right? Of course, they have to pick a side. It's very intellectually challenging to understand and invest in psychedelics, even for people with CNS background, because the brain and how the brain works is pretty rudimentally understood at this point. So yes, you can definitely invest in everything, but if I were to put my money with a professional investor, I would hope they would be focused on the psychedelic space.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. And again, having seen them, they really are very different industries. Even if you're comparing, medicinal to medicinal, they're very different industries. And there's definitely much more of a focus amongst the folks who are knowledgeable on psychedelics. Now, that still doesn't make me want to pick a side, but that said, there's something to be said for specialization at, particularly if you're talking about fund management. Again, if you're talking about a retail investor, do you want money in a psychedelic ETF and a cannabis ETF? Well, I certainly have that, so okay. But that's different.
Ken, I want to start with you here, but this really is a question that both Josh and Lindsey had kind of alluded to earlier. But, what do you see as psychedelics, like, let's call it 3.0? Is it more AI, more telemedicine, more apps, more custom genetics? What's the next chapter here?
It's really funny because 1 year ago, most of the people even didn't know that it's possible to invest in psychedelics. And right now we're already talking about psychedelics 3.0.
What's next? We're not satisfied.
I'm fully satisfied. So I think industry has a lot of challenges. So we need to prove to society that psychedelic drugs can heal people and make the life better. I also believe that second generation of psychedelic drugs will be much more efficient, so you avoid all the screening stuff and waiting 8 hours for one treatment. Regarding 3.0, I think it's bright future, maybe 20, 30 years from now, that you can take only one pill for yourself and feel better over your life, maybe 1 year, something like that.
Who wants next? What's Psychedelics 3.0?
I think what's Psychedelics, 0.0, 3.0, we are so in the beginning at this point that, it's kind of, I can see putting it in kind of separate channels. And Lindsey was doing this a little bit earlier also. And one of the things that I'm excited about is just bioinformatics. There's a lot of companies that are not just generating drugs or delivery methods, but they're generating information. And, that goes again to the question of personal genomics and, population-based studies. A lot of it's, retrospective, and, there's things like, apps being developed that go along with this that allow people to report what kind of effects that they're seeing from things, so they can, draw some particular, patterns out of it. That stuff, is maybe less understood, but it's potentially very, very powerful in terms of how it is applied by the entire industry. So that's an area that I definitely see as being maybe a little different. I don't know that I want to call it next, because I think everything's kind of evolving at the same time right now. But
I mean, listen, the space is, it's in its infancy. I think that there's going to be several very large catalysts. I think that the footprints for clinics are going to expand greatly. I think that the training protocols for not just therapists, but also, paramedics are normally frontline workers in a lot of these situations. And right now, I don't think that there's a great infrastructure for people that are recreationally using psychedelics. So I think that training and the destigmatization is going to be huge. And then, to add on the analytics point, I think you're going to start seeing, things like the Whoop strap or the Aura ring, things like that, where you're able to take real-time data and analytics.
Right now.
Like that, exactly.
We all have something, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be huge. It's very tough for people to go through on a day-to-day basis and, keep records, whether it's in a journal or things like that, of how they're feeling. As much as we can take the subjectiveness out of the equation, I think it's going to be, the foundation for this industry to grow.
One thing that's exciting about it is, if you've been watching the CNS landscape, most of the big pharma companies kind of exited it for a while. There was a kind of a desert period, because drug development for these kinds of conditions, mental health in particular, is very difficult. It's very expensive. I mean, you all saw what happened with Biogen and their Alzheimer drug, right? Which is, we don't have therapies, so maybe any therapy, whether it works or not, is salutary. What I think psychedelics will help do is there's this new huge potential that I know the big pharma sees as well. And so if we can, in fact, accelerate the bioinformatics side of it, it's not only going to be psychedelics 3.0, it's going to be pharma 3.0, because we're going to start to understand how the brain works. And when you have this many new substances entering the market that could have this kind of an impact, it is, as Josh said, it's going to happen in tandem, and it's going to transform disease management, period. And psychedelics are another reason for people to, like we, to invest in bioinformatics and further the development so that you can not only, the really interesting thing about the bioinformatics is not only is it diagnostic tools, it's how does a disease work in the body, it's how does a drug work on that disease in the body, and for which specific population might it be the most appropriate. So that's a pretty big, list of important things for any drug development, and it's super exciting. So this will also become, unfortunately, maybe for some people around the table, kind of mainstream ultimately, right? And we are only going to have a brief window in the sun as the few funds with small assets under management. I mean, I predict you're going to see NEA and, all the other big funds are probably going to be in this within 12 to 24 months.
I think that's right. And I mean, one of the things right now is that the investment size in a particular company does not move the needle for a much larger fund. They need to write bigger checks. So it kind of makes sense that we are where we are. And, to further to Lindsey's point, for anybody who's also following quantum computing, and at our firm, we do tend to look to the future. One of the first significant actual practical applications that Google has managed to figure out how to do is protein folding. And, they are able to run through a quantum computer protein folding algorithms at speeds that, saying making your head spin is actually not doing it justice. I mean, it's years of compute time in minutes, and it changes the game just completely.
Are there specific milestones that you guys are all individually looking at? So it might be that big pharma acquisition, or it could be a promising phase 3 of whatever. Is there something specific that, or regulation wise, that you guys are looking towards where you're like, that's going to be something that's going to prove to be a tipping point in the history of this industry?
I've got a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. Go ahead.
Yeah,
pick one.
All right. So in the United States, at least, the regulatory aspect of it, where the states, particularly the ones that have already decided to buck the federal government on cannabis, that's going to fall more quickly. And I think it's really important because as much as we're talking about all the drug discovery, the reality of the situation is the first thing that's going to happen is people want to legally self-medicate. And that's going to start taking place, and that's going to go towards business models that aren't necessarily drug discovery oriented or entirely drug discovery oriented. So, Field Trip is a good example of a company that's kind of got both of the, different angles, but, initially they're going with something that doesn't require them to actually have their own new active compound. So that's certainly one for me. And then the other one, which you just mentioned, which is, I think, we're all kind of mission driven, but seeing the clinical data and clinical tests to knock out particular indications and seeing it's starting to happen, but seeing, some real statistically significant results on hard things, treatment resistant depression, obviously, Alzheimer's, like, I don't know about you guys, my great vice is I don't sleep enough, and I am scared to death about Alzheimer's and dementia. My father had dementia forever. I mean, that is one, that's a milestone. Let's see some statistical data. Hopefully that's not more than a few years away in a meaningful way.
Well, let's leave this session there and continue this conversation in the breakout room. So I wanted to thank you guys, Cody, Ken, Josh, Lindsey. Thank you so much. This conversation has been amazing. Let's continue it in the break room. And you can find the find the link in the Pine Tool link, and we'll be there. So see you guys in a minute.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.